Hi and welcome to the Cult of Crafting. My name is Michael and today I'll be making concrete walls out of foam. I'll also paint them up and I'll give you all the tips and tricks I learned along the way. At the end of the video I'll tell you what went well and what I'd do differently if I had to do it over again, so make sure you stick around for that. So the aim of this video is to try and improve the quality of a simple type of terrain and make it a little more interesting to look at. I want to challenge myself and try to make it look more realistic and less stylized. I have a couple of requirements for the walls. I want some flexibility in how I can set them up, which means I'll need some corners. I want them to be stable so they won't easily fall over or move. I want to make them look as good as possible within a reasonable time frame, say a weekend. XPS foam weighs next to nothing, which means that it won't take much to topple the walls. So they'll fall over and get shoved around a lot, and you don't want that. So I'm going to add bases to the walls to give them some weight and stability. Here I'm sketching a top-down view of a wall on a base. Now when you add bases you'll find another problem. The bases might prevent you from setting up the walls against one another, so infantry can walk between the walls and shooting will have line of sight between them. Also, we're gonna have a problem of how the corners are gonna meet up. Again, the bases will be in the way if we don't construct them properly. First of all, the bases will have to not extend beyond the ends of the walls. Besides that, there are a few options. You can make L-shaped corner pieces. You can make square or even hexagonal columns where the walls can meet. Again, it's gonna be hard to make them stable, presumably. So there isn't a perfect solution, it's just a matter of weighing the pros and cons and coming up with a compromise. Try to see it as an opportunity to add detail as opposed to something that subtracts from the piece. I wanted the walls to look tall, solid and menacing. And I wanted to sculpt some details that weren't just battle damage. There are a lot of ways of making concrete walls in the real world, but I like the look of tall and slightly narrow sections for the project. So I decided to make my terrain pieces divided into 3 sections. I've noticed that concrete walls occasionally have small dimples molded into them. I found out that these are from things called snap ties. Snap ties are metal bars that run through the mold that the concrete is poured into, and their function is to make sure that the sides of the mold don't bulge from the weight of the concrete. The metal bars have a couple of small plastic cones on them that leave small dimples in the concrete. After the concrete has dried, you can snap off the snap tie in the cone and, if you want to, fill up the dimple, or you can leave it if you like the look of it. I decided to add them to the walls for a nice bit of detail. Okay, let's cut some foam. As for the size, I initially wanted to make them 15 centimeters wide and 12.5 centimeters tall, which looked good in the paper sketch, but after seeing it cut out in foam, it just looked a bit off, so I took an inch off the height, so it'd be 10 centimeters tall instead, which looked better to me. It can be difficult to get clean cuts in foam. Try to buy the foam as close to the size you want to end up with, and then cut it with a fresh blade at a shallow angle using multiple cuts. Don't saw and don't try to force it too much, you can get nice clean cuts this way. The challenge is getting a perfect 90-degree angle through the foam, because it's hard to avoid tilting the blade slightly to one side or the other. It's something I've never figured out, so if you know the secret to doing this, let me know in the comments. I happen to have a Proxylon hot wire table, so I used that instead to cut the 10 pieces of foam to size. To separate the 3 sections of concrete that each wall would have, I measured and cut 2 shallow lines all the way around, which I then traced with a pencil to make the lines more pronounced. I needed a tool for making the snap tie dimples in the concrete, so I spent some time poking a piece of foam with different tubes and pens and pencils, until I came upon a piece of most ancient and arcane technology. The mini jack. This had the right sort of conical shape I needed to make the dimples. I proceeded to make a template for the placement of the holes, so they'd at least look somewhat aligned across the sections and walls. It'd be faster than measuring them out for each one individually. I thought it would look cool to have barbed wire run along the top of the walls, and I had the idea of adding posts to both ends of the wall so the wire would have something to attach to. I've left a link in the description to a guide that shows you how I made the barbed wire. I made another little 1 by 2.5 centimeters guide to easily mark out where I wanted the posts to sit, and then I proceeded to cut out a groove. I made a cut in the center, and then I made cuts from each side at an angle. I made a handful of posts out of wooden skewers, all 5 centimeters long, so the post would protrude 2.5 centimeters from the wall. I knew the diameter of the barbed wire coil was 2 centimeters, so I used a drill to make holes in the post around 0.5 centimeter from the top, so I could stick the ends of the wire into the posts and glue them in place. To attach the posts to the walls, I covered them in PVA glue and stuck them in the grooves. To make the texture in the concrete, I used the old trick of making a tinfoil ball and rolling it across the surface of the foam walls. I also made sure to texture the edges so they'd look chipped and worn. I went fairly light because I didn't want to overdo the effect, which is something I tend to do. I made the bases to be 5 centimeters by 15 centimeters so the width would match up with the walls. I bent one end of the barbed wire to stick out at an angle, and then I shortened it so it would fit inside the hole that I made in the posts earlier. Then I cut the barbed wire so it would match up with the other post, and I'd have enough length to bend it so the end would line up with the hole in the post. The coil acted like a spring which kept the wire in place between the poles. I used PVA to glue the wires into the posts. The wires were a bit wobbly, so I glued them to the walls here and there using PVA glue. I'm using PVA because superglue melts XPS foam and superglue is a bit more brittle than PVA. Here and there the coil would lift, so I used tape to keep them in place while the PVA was drying. I added a ground texture to the base using my homemade modeling compound, which is just a mix of paper fiber and plaster. You can buy it ready-made from Geek Gaming Scenics or Sculptor Mold. I also added some debris here and there to give the bases a bit more variation. I made 2 L-shaped corner pieces by cutting out a single 5 cm wide wall section and then making a narrower 3 cm section that I glued onto the first section, which is 2 cm thick. This made it look like both sides had an even length. I also made a square base for it and cut out a notch so it would match up to the other wall sections. I decided to make a test piece for the paint job. I was going to use some new painting techniques and ideas on a large batch of terrain. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't do anything that could ruin the foam or mess up the paint job. Though I ended up using mostly acrylics for the terrain, I wanted to try an oil wash. I wanted the color of the walls to be quite light, so I started with a white base coat and added a thin black wash, hoping that I'd end up with a light grey with some shading in the texture. A common way of painting concrete is to start from black, then dry brushing with a medium grey and a beige, and finishing it with a black wash, which leaves you with a fairly dark color. I wanted the walls to be light because the concrete I see around where I live is typically quite light, and because I was going to try out some new weathering techniques which were going to darken the paint job, so the light base color should give me a nice contrast. I'm fairly new to oil washes, so I thought I'd do a side-by-side comparison with an acrylic wash. The acrylic wash looked good initially, but before it had dried, the wash ran off and pooled at the bottom of the piece. It toned the paint slightly grey, though not as much as I wanted, so I gave it another coat and left it to dry. I preferred the result I got from the oil wash. It left a nice texture on the foam and it stayed where I wanted it to be. Before applying the oil wash, I did a small test to see whether it'd affect the foam, which it didn't on the test piece. But when I applied it to the walls, it actually melted the foam that hadn't been sealed in the lines I cut into it. I'm guessing it's because it could pool there and have longer time to work on the foam before it evaporated. It wasn't too bad though. You'll often find black and green mold near the top and bottom of concrete walls, which I wanted to replicate to make the walls look grimy. I used a variety of dark greys with some greens and brown in the mix. The problem with acrylic washes on terrain, or any larger surface for that matter, is that they tend to create droplets and leave stains. I had the idea of working on a wet surface to avoid the stains. I've done something similar on miniatures before, where I blend a color into a clear medium to fade it out. I thought it might work here too. I used my test piece to get a feel for the technique. How much water would I need? How fast would I have to work? How much paint would I need? And which colors did I like? Could I pull back the colors? After playing around on my test piece for a while and getting a better feel for the technique, I switched over to the actual walls. It turns out I had a good deal more working time than I would have guessed. I thought I would have to paint each section individually, but if I worked quickly and I didn't let any one area dry out, I could work on the entire wall at the same time. You can find lichen everywhere outside in this part of the world. It's found in a variety of tones of yellows and greens. I tried stippling and speckling a few different colors, but they were barely noticeable on the grey background. Though it would have improved the look, especially from a short viewing distance, I didn't want to spend what could easily have been a couple of hours doing something that most people wouldn't notice. The yellow worked decently, so I did speckle that on the walls. I also tried adding white streaks to simulate mineral deposits from rain to the test piece, but it didn't make a huge difference, so I skipped it on the final terrain pieces. All of these small steps would have added up to something, and if I was doing a display piece, I would have gone through with them. But I had more than 10 pieces of terrain that I wanted to finish, so I felt it wasn't worth the extra effort in this particular case. I wanted the barbed wire to be rusty, so I chose an orange color and a reddish brown. I mostly used orange for the wire. I wanted to make rust streaks on the wall, so again I played around with the colors on my test piece until I got a feel for it. I used the same technique as before, where I would paint on a wet surface to get smooth fades. On the top of the walls I made rings of rust around the wire, where I had glued the wire to the foam. I picked 2 or 3 of these and I'd pulled the rust over the side to form streaks on each side of the wall. I'd also make small streaks from some of the holes from the snap ties to create some variation. I'd use the orange as the main color and the brown in the center to give the rust some depth. So, what are the takeaways from this project? I like the look of the light grey concrete and I like the weathering effects a lot. When I went into this project, I wanted to work more with oil paints because they're easier to blend. I'm really happy with the results I got from working with acrylics on a wet surface. I was surprised at how well I could blend the colors, so I'm excited about this technique and I'll definitely play around with it more. I'm glad that I went the extra mile with this project, and I could have taken it even further if I spent the time on it and done signs, posters, graffiti and so on. I was really tempted to do an Aquila. You could also do them in a more 40k-ish style with buttresses, metal panels, rivets and battle damage. The project took longer than expected. Figuring out how to do something you've never done before does naturally take some time. I used PVA glue, so drying time was a big part of it, though I'd still use it if I had to do it over again. Also, the fact that I was doing 10 walls took a lot of time. Something that only takes a couple of minutes suddenly takes more than an hour when you have to do it 10 times over, and I simply underestimated that. I had a couple of bad interactions with the products I used. I ran out of primer, so I switched to a cheaper brand that melted the foam slightly. I should have tested it before using it on a finished model, and the paint thinner I used for my oil wash also melted the foam where it could pool, though it didn't harm the foam when I tested it. Both problems could have been avoided if I hadn't skipped a step to try to save time and sealed the foam with PVA or Mod Podge beforehand. If I had to do it over again and save some time, I'd probably drop the posts for the barbed wire. Being honest, I feel that the effort of adding the posts wasn't worth it. They added a lot of time-consuming steps, and they aren't really that noticeable. If I had to do it over again, I'd see if gluing the barbed wire straight onto the walls didn't look just as good. For the barbed wire, I initially had the idea of running a few wires inside the coils between the posts, but somehow I forgot about it when I drilled the holes and glued the posts in place. At that point I felt it was too difficult to fix, so I just moved on. I should have used MDF for the bases instead of cardboard. The cardboard I used is pretty dense, so I didn't think it would absorb as much water as it did. It was about as soggy as a cardboard box that's been sitting outside in the rain, so it had no rigidity at all, and of course it warped. It's not so bad that I can't live with it, but 3mm MDF would have been a better choice for the bases. If you want to see another build, check out this video. I hope this guide was helpful. If you want more tips for crafting, join the cult by subscribing to the channel. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.